Lonely Cowman, found wounded. Stranger at dusk. He helped her, not knowing. She was a wanted outlaw. The amber sun hung low over the Texas plains like a dying ember, casting long shadows across Tom Lonely Ramsey's weathered ranch. At 47, Tom had earned every line etched into his sun-beaten face and every gray thread woven through his dark hair. The nickname Lonely wasn't just about his solitary existence. It was a badge of honor in a territory where trust could get you killed and sentiment was a luxury few could afford. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, picked her way carefully along the fence line as Tom conducted his evening patrol. The routine had become sacred to him. Check the boundaries, mend what needed mending, and return to his cabin before full darkness brought out the wolves, both the four-legged kind and the two-legged variety that plagued the frontier. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Tom surveyed his modest spread. 50 acres of stubborn land that barely sustained a small herd of cattle, but it was his. Every post, every wire, every drop of sweat that had built this place belonged to him alone. It hadn't always been this way. Once there had been laughter echoing from the cabin porch, a woman's voice calling him in for supper, and a boy's excited chatter about the day's adventures. But that was before the fever took his wife Sarah, and before his son Jacob rode away at 16, declaring he'd rather face the uncertainties of the frontier than the suffocating grief that had settled over their home like a shroud. That was 8 years ago. 8 years of silence broken only by the wind, the cattle, and his own voice talking to Duchess when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Tom guided Duchess toward the eastern boundary where his land met the wild country. This was always the last stop on his rounds, the place where civilization ended and the true West began. It was here that trouble usually announced itself, whether in the form of rustlers, drifters, or the occasional Apache war party moving through the territory. Duchess suddenly shied, her ears pricking forward as she snorted nervously. Tom's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip as he scanned the scrub brush ahead. Years of frontier living had taught him to trust his horse's instincts more than his own eyes. "Easy, girl," he murmured, dismounting to investigate. "What's got you spooked?" The answer came in the form of a low moan, barely audible above the evening breeze. Tom's blood chilled as he pushed through the thorny mesquite, following the sound. What he found nearly stopped his heart. A woman lay crumpled among the rocks and brush, her dark hair matted with blood, her clothes torn and stained. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features that spoke of a genteel upbringing, hardly the type one expected to find bleeding in the wilderness. Her breathing was shallow, labored, and a nasty gash across her forehead had painted half her face crimson. Tom knelt beside her, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, and when he carefully turned her head, he could see that while the head wound looked worse than it was, she had other injuries. Bruises around her throat, torn fingernails suggesting she'd fought her attacker, and what looked like a bullet graze along her left arm. "Ma'am?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her if she was conscious. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue that seemed to hold both fear and fierce determination. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that Tom couldn't make out. Every instinct Tom had developed over decades of frontier survival screamed at him to walk away. A wounded stranger in the middle of nowhere was trouble, plain and simple. She could be bait for a trap, or running from something that would follow her trail right to his doorstep. The smart play was to ride into town, report what he'd found to Sheriff Morrison, and let the law handle it. But as he looked down at her battered face, something stirred in his chest, something he'd thought had died with Sarah. Maybe it was the way her hand clutched at the torn fabric of her dress, trying to maintain some dignity even in her helpless state. Maybe it was the reminder of his own daughter, the one Sarah had lost in childbirth all those years ago, who would have been about this woman's age. Or maybe it was simply that Tom Ramsey, for all his hard edges and careful isolation, had never been able to walk away from someone in need. "All right, miss," he said, making his decision. "Let's get you somewhere safe." With practiced efficiency born of years handling injured cattle and the occasional wounded drifter, Tom gathered the woman in his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, almost fragile, which made the evidence of violence against her all the more disturbing. As he carried her to Duchess, she stirred again, her eyes opening to focus on his face with surprising clarity. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't let them find me." "Who?" Tom asked, settling her as gently as possible across Duchess's saddle. "Who's looking for you?" But her eyes had already closed again, and she'd slipped back into unconsciousness. Tom mounted behind her, one arm supporting her weight, while the other guided Duchess toward home. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than usual, every shadow potentially hiding a threat, every sound making him reach for his gun. By the time they reached the ranch, full darkness had settled over the land like a heavy blanket. Tom carried the woman inside, laying her on his own bed, the first time anyone other than himself had occupied it since Sarah's death. He lit the oil lamps and set about tending to her wounds with the basic medical supplies he kept on hand. The head wound, while bloody, wasn't as serious as it had first appeared. The bullet graze on her arm was clean and would heal without complications. But the bruises around her throat told a darker story, and Tom found himself wondering what kind of man would put his hands on a woman with such violence. As he worked, cleaning and bandaging her injuries, Tom studied her face in the lamplight. Even battered and unconscious, there was something striking about her, a strength in the set of her jaw, a defiance that seemed to radiate from her even in sleep. This wasn't a woman who would go down without a fight, which made her current condition all the more troubling. When he'd done all he could medically, Tom pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in to wait. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. Duchess nickered softly from the barn, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song to the stars. Tom found himself studying the woman's face, trying to piece together her story. Her hands, though torn and dirty, showed signs of recent care. These weren't the hands of someone who'd been living rough for long. Her clothes, beneath the damage, were of good quality, suggesting she came from money. But what was a well-bred woman doing alone in the wilderness, beaten and shot? As if sensing his scrutiny, her eyes opened again, immediately alert despite her injuries. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement aggravated her wounds. "Easy," Tom said, gently pressing her back down. "You're safe. You're in my cabin, and I've tended to your injuries as best I can." She studied his face with those storm-gray eyes, and Tom had the unsettling feeling she was taking his measure, deciding whether he could be trusted. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice stronger than before, but still barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said simply. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "What's your name, miss?" Tom asked. "And what happened to you out there?" A shadow crossed her face, and she looked away. "May," she said after a pause. "My name is May. As for what happened," she touched the bandage on her forehead gingerly. "I was traveling with a companion. We were set upon by bandits. I managed to escape, but—" She gestured weakly at her injuries. Tom nodded, though something about her story didn't quite ring true. The practiced way she'd delivered it, the slight hesitation before giving her name. These were the tells of someone accustomed to deception. But then again, in a territory where a person's past was often best left buried, he wasn't one to pry too deeply. "Well, May," he said, "you're welcome to stay until you're well enough to travel. I don't get much company out here, and I reckon Duchess could use a break from being my only conversation partner." For the first time since he'd found her, May smiled, a small, tentative expression that transformed her entire face. "You're very kind, Mr. Ramsey. Tom Ramsey. Most folks call me Lonely." "Lonely?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Tom gestured around the sparse cabin. "Not much for company, I suppose. Haven't had a visitor in, well, Longer than I care to remember." May's expression softened. "Then I'm honored to be your guest, Mr. Ramsey, and I promise as soon as I'm able I'll be out of your hair." As Tom prepared to settle in the chair for the night, giving May the bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet, ordered life had just taken a turn toward something far more complicated. But for the first time in 8 years, the silence of his cabin didn't feel quite so oppressive. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and somewhere in the darkness, unknown eyes might be watching, waiting. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, Tom "Lonely" Ramsey had found something he'd thought lost forever, a reason to hope that tomorrow might bring something other than another day of solitary routine. He had no way of knowing that the woman sleeping in his bed was worth more dead than alive to half the territory, or that by morning his simple act of mercy would have set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. 3 days had passed since Tom found May bleeding in the scrub, and already his carefully ordered world had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The woman who'd introduced herself with such careful hesitation had proven to be a surprisingly easy houseguest. Quiet when he needed to work, helpful despite her injuries, and possessed of a quick wit that had drawn more laughter from Tom than he'd experienced in years. But it was the small things that unsettled him most. The way she always positioned herself with a clear view of both the door and window. How she'd startled awake that first night at the sound of settling timber, her hand moving instinctively to where a weapon might rest. The practiced efficiency with which she'd cleaned and loaded his spare rifle when he'd mentioned riding out to check the cattle. "You handle that like you know what you're doing," Tom had observed, watching her work the lever action with smooth precision. May had paused, seeming to realize she'd revealed more than intended. "My father believed a woman should know how to protect herself," she'd said carefully. "The frontier isn't kind to the helpless." True enough, Tom thought. But there was a difference between knowing how to use a weapon and the kind of familiarity that came from regular practice. May handled the rifle like someone who'd relied on it for survival, not just protection. On this particular morning, Tom was mending fence in the south pasture when he heard the thunder of approaching hooves. 3 riders crested the hill, moving fast and purposeful toward his cabin. Tom's blood chilled as he recognized the lead rider, Deputy Marshal Jake Crenshaw, a man whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his greed. Tom spurred his horse toward the cabin, arriving just as the 3 men dismounted. Crenshaw was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth that seemed permanently twisted in a sneer. The 2 men with him were clearly hired guns, the kind of men who sold their services to whoever paid best and asked no questions about the work. "Ramsey," Crenshaw called out as Tom approached. "Heard you might have had some visitors lately." "Can't say that I have," Tom replied carefully, dismounting but keeping his hand near his gun. "What brings you out this way, Deputy?" Crenshaw pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, shaking it open to reveal a wanted poster. Even from a distance, Tom could see it was a woman's face sketched in black ink, though the details were unclear. "Looking for a woman," Crenshaw said, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Goes by several names, but she's wanted for robbery and murder. Dangerous as a rattlesnake and twice as quick. Worth $500 to the man who brings her in." Tom's mouth went dry, but he kept his expression neutral. "500? Must be some woman. What's she supposed to have done?" "Robbed the cattleman's bank in San Antonio 2 weeks ago," one of the hired guns spoke up. "Killed a guard and wounded 2 others. They call her the Sparrow on account of how quick she is." Crenshaw shot the man a sharp look, clearly not appreciating the interruption. "Point is, Ramsey, she was seen heading this direction after the robbery. Wounded, probably looking for somewhere to hole up. You sure you haven't seen anything unusual?" Tom shook his head. "Nothing but cattle and coyotes out here, Deputy. You're welcome to look around if you want, but I'm afraid you're wasting your time." For a moment, Crenshaw studied Tom's face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading lies. Then his gaze shifted to the cabin, and Tom's heart nearly stopped as he saw a shadow move past one of the windows. If Crenshaw had noticed, but the deputy's attention was already moving on, scanning the outbuildings and corrals. "Maybe so," he said finally, but I'll be keeping an eye on this area. If this woman does turn up, you'd be smart to send word immediately. She's not the kind of person you want to cross. I'll keep that in mind, Tom said. Crenshaw remounted his horse, but before leaving, he leaned down toward Tom. One more thing, Ramsey. There's talk in town about you living out here all alone, getting strange in the head. Some folks think maybe you've been keeping company with someone you shouldn't. Wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong idea about your loyalties. The threat was clear enough. Tom met Crenshaw's gaze steadily. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, Deputy, but I reckon I can take care of myself. Crenshaw smiled, but there was no warmth in it. See that you do. The three men rode off, but Tom waited until they were well out of sight before heading into the cabin. He found May standing by the window, the spare rifle in her hands and her face pale but determined. "How much did you hear?" Tom asked. "Enough," she said quietly. "They're looking for someone called the Sparrow, a bank robber and killer worth $500. She turned to face him, and Tom saw something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before, a deep, weary sadness. "You want to know if that's me?" Tom studied her face. This woman who'd brought laughter back into his home, who'd helped him mend harness and cook meals and fill the silence that had been his only companion for so long. "Do I?" May set the rifle aside and sank into one of the wooden chairs by the table. For a long moment, she stared at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My real name is Margaret Sinclair, and yes, I robbed the cattleman's bank in San Antonio." She looked up at him, her storm-gray eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I didn't kill anyone, Tom. I swear to you on my mother's grave, I never killed that guard." Tom felt the world shift beneath his feet. Everything he'd begun to feel for this woman, the companionship, the growing affection, the hope for something beyond his solitary existence, suddenly seemed built on lies. "Then why?" he asked. "Why rob a bank? You're not some desperate outlaw. Anyone can see you come from good people." Margaret, he couldn't think of her as May anymore, laughed bitterly. "Good people. Yes, I suppose I did, once upon a time. My father was Judge Harrison Sinclair, one of the most respected men in Texas. My mother came from old money, the kind of family that traces its lineage back to English nobility." She stood and began pacing, her movements restless and agitated. "I was raised to be a proper lady, Tom. Piano lessons and French tutors and all the refinements money could buy. What happened? I fell in love with the wrong man." Her voice turned hard. "His name was Daniel Morrison. Charming, handsome, from a good family. Everything my parents wanted for me. We were engaged to be married, and I thought I was the luckiest woman in Texas." Tom waited, sensing there was more to the story. 3 months before our wedding, I discovered what kind of man Daniel really was. He was involved with a group of men who were buying up land from Mexican families, using forged documents and intimidation. When the families refused to sell, terrible things happened. Houses burned, cattle poisoned, people disappeared. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. I confronted Daniel about it, and he laughed, said it was just business, that the Mexicans didn't deserve the land anyway. When I threatened to go to the authorities, he told me that my own father was involved, that Judge Sinclair had been signing the forged documents and legitimizing the land grabs in exchange for a percentage of the profits. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. Your father was as corrupt as the rest of them. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. Said it was the way of the world, that the strong take from the weak, and that's how civilization advances. Margaret's voice broke slightly. He told me I could either marry Daniel and keep quiet, or I could find myself disowned and penniless. So you ran. I tried to, but Daniel wasn't about to let his investment walk away. He had men watching me, following me. I managed to escape one night, but I had no money, no resources. I was sleeping in barns and stealing food just to survive. She turned to face Tom, and he could see the pain in her eyes. That's when I met Carlos Mendoza. Who's Carlos? A man whose family lost everything to Daniel's scheme. His parents were murdered when they refused to sign over their ranch. Carlos had been tracking the men responsible, trying to gather evidence to bring them to justice. Margaret's expression hardened. He taught me that sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes you have to take justice into your own hands. Tom was beginning to understand. The bank robbery. The cattleman's bank was where Daniel and his associates kept their money from the land deals. Carlos and I planned to rob it, take back what they'd stolen, and use the evidence we'd gathered to expose the whole operation. Margaret's voice grew bitter. But someone betrayed us. When we got to the bank, there were men waiting. Carlos was shot down in the street like a dog. I barely escaped, and only because the guard, the one they say I killed, helped me get away. Then who killed him? Daniel's men. They couldn't afford to have any witnesses, anyone who might talk about what they'd really been doing. Margaret sank back into the chair, suddenly looking very young and very tired. So now I'm wanted for robbery and murder, while the real killers walk free. Tom absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the woman he'd come to know with the story she'd just told. It explained so much. Her wariness, her skill with weapons, the way she'd flinched when he'd first touched her injured arm. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. Margaret looked up at him, and Tom saw something vulnerable in her expression. "Because you saved my life, and you deserve to know the truth. Because you've been kinder to me than anyone has in months, and I couldn't bear to keep lying to you." She paused. "And because I think you're a good man, Tom Ramsey, and good men are rarer than gold in this territory." Tom walked to the window, staring out at the land he'd worked so hard to build, the life he'd carefully constructed in the wake of loss and grief. Everything was about to change. He could feel it in his bones. By harboring Margaret, he was making himself an enemy of powerful men, men who wouldn't hesitate to destroy him to protect their secrets. But as he turned back to look at her, this woman who'd brought light back into his dark world, who'd reminded him what it felt like to care about someone again, Tom realized his choice had already been made. "Well then, Margaret Sinclair," he said quietly, "I reckon we'd better figure out how to keep you alive long enough to clear your name." For the first time since she'd begun her story, Margaret smiled, a real smile, full of hope and gratitude. "You believe me?" Tom nodded. "I've gotten pretty good at reading people over the years, and everything you've told me fits with what I know about men like Crenshaw and the kind of corruption that's been eating away at this territory like a cancer." Outside, the wind was picking up again, and storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Tom had the feeling that the weather was the least of the storms heading their way. But for now, in the warm circle of lamplight, he wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in 8 years, Tom Lonely Ramsey had something worth fighting for. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke just after midnight, announcing itself with a crack of thunder that shook the cabin's windows and sent rain hammering against the roof like bullets. Tom jerked awake in his chair, instantly alert, his hand moving to the gun at his hip before he fully remembered where he was. Margaret was already sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and focused on the door. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Tom listened, trying to separate the sounds of the storm from anything more sinister. Thunder rolled across the plains again, but underneath it, he thought he heard something else, the distant whinny of horses, quickly cut off. "Stay here," he murmured, moving to the window and carefully peering through a gap in the curtains. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark black and white, and in that brief moment, Tom saw them. At least 6 men positioned around his property, using the storm as cover for their approach. "We've got company," he said grimly, checking his rifle and the spare ammunition. "Looks like Crenshaw decided not to wait for an invitation." Margaret was already moving, despite her injuries. She'd dressed quickly and was now loading the spare rifle with practiced efficiency. "How many?" 6 that I can see. Probably more." Tom moved to the back window, confirming his fears. "They've got us surrounded." "Tom," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the danger, "you don't have to do this. You could turn me over to them, tell them you just discovered who I was. They might believe you." Tom looked at her. This woman who'd become so much more than a stranger in need, who'd reminded him what it felt like to have purpose beyond mere survival. "That's not happening. You could die for me. Is that really worth it?" Tom was quiet for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside. When he spoke, His voice was soft but certain. Margaret, 8 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife, my son, my faith in tomorrow. I've been living like a ghost ever since, going through the motions but not really alive. He met her eyes. These past few days with you, I remembered what it felt like to be human again. So yes, it's worth it. Before Margaret could respond, a voice boomed across the yard, barely audible above the storm. "Ramsey! We know she's in there. Send her out and nobody has to get hurt." Tom recognized Crenshaw's voice, though the deputy was clearly trying to sound official and reasonable. "What do you want me to tell him?" he called to Margaret. "Tell him to go to hell," she replied with a fierce smile. Tom grinned despite their dire situation. He moved to the door, staying well back from the opening. "Deputy Crenshaw, you're on my property without a warrant. I suggest you and your men move along before someone gets hurt." "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Ramsey," Crenshaw shouted back. "The woman's a killer. You're harboring a fugitive. The only killers I see are the ones surrounding my home in the middle of the night," Tom replied. "You want her? You'll have to come through me." The response was immediate. A rifle shot that splintered the doorframe inches from Tom's head. The battle had begun. "So much for due process," Margaret muttered, taking position at the side window. "I count 3 on this side." Tom moved to the front window, using the heavy wooden table as cover. 2 more by the barn, and at least 1 behind the well. Another shot rang out, this one shattering the front window and sending glass cascading across the floor. For the next several minutes, the cabin became a fortress under siege. Tom and Margaret worked together with surprising coordination, covering each other as they moved between windows, making every shot count. Tom's years of hunting and frontier survival served him well, while Margaret's desperation and skill with firearms made her a formidable opponent. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and both knew it was only a matter of time before their ammunition ran low or the attackers found a way to flush them out. "Tom!" Margaret called during a brief lull in the gunfire. "There's something you need to know." "Kinda busy right now," Tom replied, taking aim at a muzzle flash near the barn. "Daniel Morrison, the man I told you about. He's not just some land grabber." Margaret's voice was urgent. "His real name is Daniel Morrison Crenshaw. He's the deputy's brother." Tom's blood turned to ice. Everything suddenly made sense. Why Crenshaw had been so determined to find Margaret. Why he'd brought hired guns instead of regular deputies. Why this felt more like a personal vendetta than a lawful arrest. "That's why they can't let me live," Margaret continued. "I have evidence that could destroy both of them. Documents, witness statements, proof of the murders and land fraud." "Where?" Tom asked, ducking as another bullet whined overhead. "Hidden in my saddlebags, the ones I lost when I was shot." Margaret's face was grim. "If Crenshaw finds them—" A new sound cut through the storm, the crackle of flames. Tom looked out to see orange light dancing against the barn walls. "They're trying to burn us out." The attackers had set fire to the hay stored in the lean-to beside the cabin, and despite the rain, the flames were spreading. Smoke began to seep through the walls, and Tom realized they had minutes before the cabin became uninhabitable. "We have to run for it," he said. "There's a creek about 100 yards behind the cabin. If we can reach it—" "Tom, wait!" Margaret grabbed his arm, her eyes bright with sudden determination. "I know where my saddlebags are. There's a cave about 2 miles north of here, near the old Apache Trail. That's where I was hiding before they found me. We'll never make it 2 miles with them chasing us. We will if we split up." Margaret's voice was calm, resolved. "You head for the creek, make noise, draw them after you. I'll circle around and get to the cave." "Absolutely not. We stick together." "Tom, listen to me." Margaret gripped his shoulders, her eyes fierce. "Those documents are the only way to clear my name and bring Daniel and Crenshaw to justice. Without them, I'm just a fugitive for the rest of my life, however short that might be." The smoke was getting thicker, and the heat from the flames was becoming unbearable. Tom knew they were out of time, but every instinct screamed against leaving Margaret to face the danger alone. "There's another reason," Margaret said softly. "Something I haven't told you." "What?" Your son, Jacob. He's not dead, Tom. He's alive, and he's been working with Carlos and me to expose the corruption in this territory. Tom's world tilted. That's impossible. Jacob left 8 years ago. I haven't heard from him since. Because he's been using a different name, trying to protect you from his activities. He calls himself Jake Mendoza now. Carlos was his partner, not just mine. Margaret's eyes were bright with tears. He's the one who sent me here, Tom. He knew I was wounded and told me to find his father, the only man in the territory he trusted completely. Tom staggered, overwhelmed by the revelation. His son, alive, and fighting the same fight that had brought Margaret into his life. He's waiting at the cave, Margaret continued. If I don't show up by dawn, he'll assume I'm dead and disappear forever. This might be your only chance to see him again. The decision was made for them as a burning beam crashed down near the door, sending sparks flying across the room. Tom grabbed Margaret's hand, pulling her toward the back window. The creek first, he said firmly. Then we go to the cave together. They burst through the back window into the storm, immediately separating as planned. Tom fired several shots and shouted, drawing the attention of the attackers as he crashed through the brush toward the creek. Behind him, he could hear men shouting and giving chase, but his mind wasn't on the pursuit anymore. It was on the impossible hope that somewhere in the darkness ahead, his son was waiting, alive, and fighting for justice in a world that had taken so much from both of them. The storm raged on, but for the first time in 8 years, Tom Lonely Ramsey was running toward something instead of away from it. And whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the Texas plains, the storm having passed but leaving the air thick with moisture and the scent of rain-washed earth. Tom crouched in the mesquite brush 50 yards from the cave entrance, his clothes still damp from his midnight flight through the creek, his heart hammering with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that had nothing to do with their narrow escape from Crenshaw's men. The cave was exactly where Margaret had said it would be, a narrow opening in a limestone outcropping that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. And there, standing guard at the entrance with a rifle cradled in his arms, was a man Tom would have recognized anywhere, despite the 8 years and the full beard that now covered his face. Jacob, his son, alive. The young man, for Jacob was 24 now, no longer the angry 16-year-old who'd ridden away in grief and fury, had inherited his father's height and broad shoulders, but his movements carried a confidence and purpose that Tom remembered from his own younger days. This wasn't the broken boy who'd fled their home. This was a man who'd found his calling in the fight for justice. Margaret emerged from the cave behind Jacob, and Tom saw his son's face transform with relief. They spoke in low voices, too quiet for Tom to hear, but he could see the urgency in their gestures. Margaret was pointing in different directions, clearly explaining the night's events and the danger they still faced. Tom took a deep breath and stepped out of the brush. "Hello, son." Jacob spun around, his rifle coming up instinctively before recognition dawned in his eyes that were the same deep brown as his mother's. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across the years of separation and silence. "Pa?" Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. Margaret said she'd found you, but I couldn't quite believe—" "You've grown up," Tom said simply, drinking in the sight of his son. "You look good, Jacob. Strong." "It's Jake now," his son replied, lowering the rifle. "Jake Mendoza. Safer that way, given the work I've been doing." Tom nodded, understanding. "Margaret told me some of it. About Carlos, about what you've been fighting against." He paused. "I'm proud of you, son. Your mother would be too." Jacob's composure cracked slightly. "I thought about coming home so many times over the years, but I was afraid you'd blame me for leaving when you needed me most." "The only thing I blame you for," Tom said, stepping closer, "is staying away so long." The reunion was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Margaret quickly pulled both men into the cave, where she'd already retrieved her hidden saddlebags and spread their contents across a flat rock. Tom's eyes widened as he saw the evidence she'd gathered. Legal documents, witness statements, even photographs of some of the men involved in the land fraud scheme. "This is enough to bring down half the territorial government," Jacob said grimly. "But we have to get it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated." "Judge Parker in Fort Smith," Margaret suggested. "He's got a reputation for honesty." "That's 3 days hard riding," Tom pointed out. "And Crenshaw's not going to give up. He'll have men watching every trail between here and Arkansas." The sound of horses was getting closer. Jacob moved to the cave entrance, peering out carefully. 6 riders, coming up the canyon. Looks like our friend the deputy marshal brought reinforcements." Tom joined his son at the cave mouth, studying the approaching men. Crenshaw was in the lead, his face twisted with fury and determination. Behind him rode his brother Daniel, a handsome man in his 30s whose expensive clothes and soft features spoke of a life lived in comfort and corruption. The other 4 were clearly hired guns, the kind of men who'd kill for money and sleep soundly afterward. "They're not here to arrest anyone," Tom observed. "They're here to eliminate witnesses." Then we make our stand here," Jacob said, checking his ammunition. "This cave has good cover, and there's only one way in." "No," Margaret said firmly. "There's another way." She pointed to a narrow passage at the back of the cave. "It leads to a hidden exit about a 1/4 mile up the canyon. Carlos and I used it as an escape route." "You two go," Tom said. "I'll hold them off. Give you time to get away." "Like hell," Jacob replied. "I'm not losing you again, Pa. We all go, or we all stay." Before anyone could argue further, Crenshaw's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Come out now, and maybe we can work something out." Tom stepped into the cave entrance, making himself visible. "What kind of deal are you offering, Deputy?" "The kind where you walk away from this alive," Crenshaw shouted back. "You're in over your head, Ramsey. You don't know what kind of people you're protecting." "I know exactly what kind of people I'm protecting," Tom replied. "The kind who fight for justice instead of profit. The kind who risk their lives to expose corruption and murder." Daniel Crenshaw rode forward, his voice smooth and cultured. "Mr. Ramsey, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The woman you're harboring is a dangerous criminal. She's filled your head with lies about me and my associates. The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for years." Margaret appeared beside Tom, her voice ringing with righteous anger. "About the families you've murdered, about the land you've stolen, about the judge you've corrupted." Daniel's mask of civility slipped. "You should have stayed hidden, Margaret. Should have taken the money I offered and disappeared. Now you've involved innocent people in your crusade. The only innocent people here are the ones you've been destroying." Margaret held up a thick folder of documents. "I have everything, Daniel. Every forged deed, every bribed official, every murdered family, and copies are already on their way to Judge Parker." It was a bluff. The documents hadn't been sent anywhere yet, but it had the desired effect. Daniel's face went white, and he turned to his brother with panic in his eyes. "She's lying," Crenshaw said, but Tom could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Are you willing to bet your life on that?" Jacob called out, stepping into view. "Because that's what you're doing. The evidence is already in motion. Kill us, and you just confirm your guilt." For a moment, the canyon was silent except for the sound of wind through the rocks. Tom could see the wheels turning in the Crenshaw brothers' minds, weighing their options, calculating the odds. Then, Daniel made his choice. His hand moved to his gun, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. The battle was fierce but brief. The cave provided excellent cover for Tom, Jacob, and Margaret, while the attackers were exposed in the open canyon. Tom's years of frontier experience, combined with Jacob's military training and Margaret's desperate skill, proved more than a match for hired guns who were used to intimidating unarmed farmers and townspeople. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the hired guns were down, and Daniel Crenshaw lay motionless near his horse, a bullet through his heart. Deputy Crenshaw himself was wounded, but alive, his gun hand shattered, and his arrogance replaced by fear. "It's over," Tom said, emerging from the cave with his rifle trained on the surviving attackers. "Your brother's dead, your hired guns are finished, and the evidence is going to Judge Parker whether you like it or not." Crenshaw looked up at him with hatred in his eyes. "You think this ends it?" There are others, Ramsey, powerful men who won't let this stand. Then they'll have to answer to Judge Parker, Jacob said, binding Crenshaw's wounded hand with rough efficiency, and to every honest lawman between here and Fort Smith. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Crenshaw and the surviving gunman as prisoners, the evidence secure in Margaret's saddlebags, Tom found himself walking beside his son for the first time in 8 years. "What happens now?" Jacob asked. "After we deliver the evidence? After the trials are over?" Tom looked at his son, then at Margaret, who was riding ahead with quiet dignity, despite everything she'd endured. "I was thinking maybe it's time I stopped being so lonely. Maybe it's time our family started healing." Jacob smiled, the first real smile Tom had seen from him since he was a boy. "I'd like that, Pa. I'd like that very much." 3 weeks later, Tom stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. The trials in Fort Smith had been swift and decisive. Judge Parker had shown no mercy to the corrupt officials and land grabbers who'd terrorized the territory for years. Margaret's name had been cleared, her courage in exposing the conspiracy earning her recognition as a hero rather than an outlaw. Jacob had decided to stay, helping his father rebuild not just the cabin, but their relationship. And Margaret? Margaret had accepted Tom's quiet proposal with tears in her eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. As if summoned by his thoughts, she appeared beside him on the porch, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Ramsey. Just thinking about how much can change in a few weeks," Tom replied, squeezing her hand gently. "A month ago, I was the loneliest man in Texas. Now you're stuck with a former outlaw and a son who's determined to become a lawman," Margaret said with a laugh. "Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" Tom turned to look at her. This remarkable woman who'd brought light back into his world, who'd reunited him with his son, who'd reminded him that love was worth fighting for. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Tom Lonely Ramsey realized that his nickname no longer fit. He wasn't lonely anymore, and he never would be again. He'd found his family, his purpose, and his future in the most unlikely of circumstances. And sometimes, that's exactly how the best stories begin. This was another story about the Old West. If you liked it, like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, and to help the channel grow and have new, amazing stories of the Old West.